Hi, this is David Carr, here to share some of the cool new things you can do to showcase your events on your website using RSVPMaker. RSVPMaker is a free plugin for WordPress that adds event publishing, event registration, event payment, and email newsletter, email invitation capabilities. One recent improvement is increased flexibility to display your events in lots of different ways, in lots of dramatic ways on your website. Now, this is a plugin that allows you to register people for your events without them having to click away to Meetup or Eventbrite or any other site. You can keep their attention. You can allow them, after they finish registering for your event, to discover other cool things that you've got going on, whether it's your blog or your products or your nonprofit mission. All of the events that I'm sharing are modeled on some work that I've done for Swank Specialty Produce. All the best chefs in South Florida get their produce there, and they hold these wonderful gourmet dinners. Each of these events has a featured image designated. So that's the image that's shown very dramatically at the top of each event post, but we can also use that in our summary view. Here's a quick tour. To achieve these effects, I'm working with what's called the query loop. The query loop in WordPress is a visual representation of the database lookup that pulls out a series of blog posts or other content items and presents them on the page. I'm using my own customized RSVPMaker query loop variation. Pretty much the controls work the same. You would select the number of items you want to show per page, but then within the query loop is this post template that defines what elements will be displayed within it. This says for each post we want the title, followed by the featured image, followed by a customized version of the excerpt block for RSVPMaker content, and you can customize that post template to use different content blocks in a different order. You can also make changes like changing this from 2 columns to 3. For anyone who's not super familiar with WordPress or hasn't used it lately, I should back up and explain this concept of blocks. Now, in the WordPress editor, every type of content can have its own visual representation as a block that has different formatting controls on this button bar up top, as well as over on the right, we have some basic controls for setting a background, for example, or setting the text color. But when I move from the paragraph to the heading, the controls on the button bar and on the right change. When I go to an image, I get controls that are specific to an image, like do I want to use the original aspect ratio or do I want to square this off? And then we can have blocks that do formatting for us, for example, columns. Now, whenever you get into these kind of layout-focused blocks, it helps to use this outline view. It's this little stair-step icon in the upper left, and this allows us to see that there's a columns block that defines that this should be 2 columns. We could change that to 3 if we wanted to. And within the columns block, there is a block for representing each column. So for example, I could select a second column, and I'll go into the sidebar, and actually there's 2 panels of settings here. There's basic settings, but then there's also these stylings over here. So in some cases that is divided up if it's a more complicated block. So I'll set the background color for this to black and the text color to white. And that's changing the color for most of these things. Actually, I need to go in and find my heading. And for some reason, I need to set that separately. But at any rate, we can manipulate the text within these, and again, there's a hierarchy here where we have the columns, the individual column, the heading, the paragraph, and then the bullet list all have their own controls as blocks. Now, if we want to add a new block, we can go to a blank line, and we'll see this little plus button over here. There's also a plus button in the upper left-hand corner. Either way, this gives you a few more search options. So this is showing the variety of things we can insert. And if I start typing in RSVP, I'll see a bunch of things that I can add that are specific to the RSVPMaker function. For example, if I wanted to insert a calendar view of my upcoming items, I can do that. And then people can then click on the individual item, or they can navigate through. So if I jump ahead from April to May, it'll show me just the events that are starting in May. And actually, if you have a query loop block on the same page, that will also change to be the events starting in May. But the real workhorse up till now has been something called the RSVPMaker upcoming block. So RSVP upcoming events gives me an events listing, and I have an option here of including the calendar or not including the calendar. But the drawback to this compared to the query loop method that I've been showing you is that this doesn't give you as much power to change the format of what's displayed within the loop. Now, by the way, I was showing over here two columns, and we had two columns in the query loop block, but we didn't see them as separate because the idea is the query loop is a database lookup. It's looking up each individual item, and it's displaying them all according to a single template. Now, you can also use the standard query loop, and there might be cases where you're trying to modify a page that was previously set up with the standard query loop, and I'll show you how you can make some tweaks. But the trade-off with the standard query loop is, first, we're going to be prompted to choose a layout. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but we can choose this standard one here. And then we're going to have to specify that this is not being used in a template. So instead of inheriting from a template what should be displayed, we're going to set the specific post type, and we'll change that to be RSVPMaker event. Now, a problem here is that this is not clearly displaying the event date. In fact, it's showing a different date, which is the date that the item was published, which is not that helpful in terms of seeing when things are coming up and what you might want to attend. So if I was working with this, I would go through and I would replace this standard excerpt here. So the RSVPMaker query loop excerpt gives us the date neatly formatted with the Add to Google Calendar button, the Add to Outlook button, and then we can just get rid of this publication date, which might be confusing. And also this block gives us the option of showing the RSVP button. So this is kind of an all-in-one solution for adding those elements. I could also turn off the display of the RSVP button and the date, and I can add the date in separately. And one reason I might want to do that is to format it a little bit differently. So we'll add, I can do the /, so RSVPMaker date block. I can also add the RSVP button. As a separate block, and that comes in handy if I want to make changes to the text of it. Maybe I want to make this register instead of RSP now, and then I can change this to be centered. I could go into the stylings for the individual block and change the background color to be black. If we look at some other examples, this one doesn't have 2 or 3 columns of events, but if we look inside the post template, for each event, there's actually a columns block, and in the left column is the featured image. In the right column is the title and the RSVPMaker excerpt. Or this one uses what's called the cover block, which gives us a background image and then other blocks that we embed inside that image can be superimposed on top of it. So the title is in there, the date block is in there, and then after that we have the excerpt and the button where I've taken the time to change the color of the button. This layout is set up to show the next event in full detail. So the very next event is set up by telling this that we only want one event to be displayed. But the toast template has a cover block up top, the title, the date, and the button are all embedded inside that cover block. And then we have a block called content that displays the full content of the post. So instead of the excerpt, we have the full content in this version. And then down beneath that, we can have a listing of all the other events. So if you can't go to the next event, maybe you can go to one of these others. So here the query loop block has a parameter set called offset. So it's up to 20 events, but offset of 1 means we're going to skip the first one, because the first one's going to be displayed in detail up top. And then we have a post template that's more like the ones we've seen elsewhere that has the query loop excerpt read more and the RSVPMaker button. In this case, it's centered. Now, some of the additional things you get with the RSVPMaker query loop variation, again, it's just a variation. It is the standard query loop block, but just with a couple of extra features and presets. But in the right sidebar, we can actually toggle this between showing future events and past. Maybe there's some place on your site where you want to have a listing of past events so people can see other recent events in a series. Or we can set a category. So there's a category called featured. Actually, I'm going to apply that to the top one. So this is an alternative to listing just the next event. We can list a featured event. So we have a category called featured. And so now this is going to pull in the featured event. And down here, instead of saying skip one, we can turn off the offset so that it will show the next upcoming event. In the sidebar down here, we have the option to exclude a category. So this is our featured event. Right now it's showing up twice. We don't want that, so we can say we want the featured event to be excluded, and now it doesn't show up there. So we can have the up top set to show the featured event, and the listing down the bottom set up to show everything except the featured event. Now, when you use the RSVPMaker query loop variation, you do get those extra controls. You also get this preset 2-column layout, but I can replace that. By clicking Replace here, I can see what this would look like in a variety of other formats. And so I could switch, say, to this one. The only thing is that my specific blocks for RSVPMaker disappeared there. And so I need to go back in and add the date, add the button if I want those to be displayed. To read a blog post that goes into more detail, visit rsvpmaker.com. Hey, one more thing. RSVPMaker is all about getting that call to action, getting people to click the button. Please click the like button. Please post a comment to let me know if this was valuable.